After she slapped me and my son did nothing, I walked out of that ballroom without a word. They thought I was retreating in shame. In reality, I was making one phone call to my advisor with a single order: liquidate their entire life. My name is Livia Rossi, and for 68 years I believed that silence was a form of grace. I thought that navigating the world with quiet dignity was the ultimate sign of strength, a lesson taught to me by a generation that valued discretion above all else. I was wrong. Grace has its limits. Dignity can be weaponized against you, and sometimes the only answer to profound disrespect is not silence, but a storm. A storm that washes away every lie, every assumption, and leaves only the hard, cold truth in its wake. This is the story of my storm. It began with the sharpest sound I have ever heard. It wasn't the clinking of champagne glasses or the soft murmur of 200 of Charleston's finest gathered at the Palmetto Grand Club. It was the crack of a hand against skin, my skin. The slap was so fast, so vicious, that my glasses flew from my face, skittering across the marble floor before shattering against the leg of a table laden with cream-colored roses. The scent of magnolias and entitlement hung heavy in the air, but now it was mixed with something else, the metallic tang of shock. My cheek burned with a furious heat, but it was nothing compared to the glacial ice that instantly formed in my chest. Isabel, my new daughter-in-law, stood before me, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure avarice, her knuckles still pink from the impact. "That's for refusing," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried through the cavernous ballroom. The silence was absolute. "This is my wedding day, Livia. The least you can do is give Leo his father's ring. A dead man doesn't need it, and a lonely old woman has no right to keep it." Her words were designed to strip me bare, to paint me as a senile, selfish crone clinging to relics of a past that no longer mattered. A lonely old woman. The phrase echoed in the dead air. I risked a glance at my son Leo. My boy. The one I had taught to ride a bicycle. The one whose tears I had dried after his first heartbreak. He stood beside his bride, his handsome face pale, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on his $1,000 Italian shoes. He didn't just stand still, he took a small, almost imperceptible step back, creating a physical chasm between us. In that single movement, he chose his side. He abandoned me in front of the world they had built together. The silence in that room was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard. It was the sound of being judged by people who only saw the surface. If you have ever felt completely misunderstood by the very people who should know you best, do me a small favor and just type the name of the city you're listening from in the comments. I want to see how far this story of quiet strength can travel. The ring she spoke of was not just a piece of jewelry. It was my husband Robert's signet ring, a heavy band of gold bearing the Rossi family crest, worn smooth by his father and his grandfather before him. It was the ring he'd twisted on his finger when he was deep in thought. The ring that had tapped impatiently on the table when he was waiting for me. The ring I had slipped from his hand in the cold, quiet hospital room after he took his final breath. It was 40 years of marriage, of shared dreams and silent promises, all contained in a small circle of gold. And this girl, this child of instant gratification and hollow ambition, believed she had the right to demand it. Slowly, deliberately, I bent down. My knees creaked in protest, but I ignored them. With trembling fingers, I gathered the fractured pieces of my glasses. The trembling wasn't from fear or frailty. It was the tremor of a seismic shift happening deep within me. The quiet, graceful Livia, the one who endured condescending remarks about her modest townhouse and her ancient Buick, was fracturing just like the lenses in my hand. For 2 years I had watched this woman chip away at my son's character, turning him into her beautiful, spineless echo. I had held my tongue out of love for him, hoping he would see the truth. But as I rose to my feet, the shards of glass digging into my palm, I understood. You cannot save a man who refuses to see he is drowning, and you cannot offer grace to a viper. All you can do is remind it why you should never, ever be cornered. She hadn't just slapped an old woman. She had awakened a queen in a kingdom she didn't even know existed, and the rent was about to come due. As I stood, the shards of my glasses biting into my palm, the burning on my cheek was already a distant memory. That was a simple, physical pain. It would fade. What wouldn't fade was the image of my son Leo taking that single, deliberate step away from me. It was a step that crossed a chasm wider than the grand ballroom, a step that landed him in a different world, a world where his mother's dignity was a fair price to pay for his wife's satisfaction. The silence that had filled the room after Isabel's shriek was now a roaring in my ears, the sound of a 40-year-old bridge of love and sacrifice collapsing into dust. His betrayal wasn't in the silence. It was in that single, cowardly step. To understand the depth of that wound, you have to understand the Leo that used to be. The boy I raised was not this hollow man in a tuxedo. My Leo was the kid who spent a whole Saturday helping our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, fix her fence after a storm, refusing any payment other than a slice of her famous peach pie. He was the young man who, after his first real job, used his entire bonus to buy me a new set of garden tools because he saw mine were getting rusty. He was the son who called me every Sunday at 4 p.m., sharp, not out of duty, but because he genuinely wanted to hear about my week at the local historical society, about the new rose variety I was trying to grow. He was kind, he was decent, and he was mine. Then came Isabel. She didn't arrive like a storm. She seeped into our lives like a slow-acting poison, sweet on the surface but corrosive underneath. At first it was subtle. Little comments wrapped in fake concern. "Oh, Livia, you're so content with the simple things. Leo has so much ambition, I just want to see him reach his full potential." His potential, I soon learned, was a life financed by debt, measured in brand names, and showcased on social media. She began to reframe his contentment as complacency, his honesty as naivety, and his love for his quiet Charleston roots as a limitation. The Sunday calls became shorter. "Sorry, Mom. Izzy and I have brunch reservations." Then they became texts. Then they became nothing. The fixer, the boy who helped Mrs. Gable, was slowly convinced that the only person he needed to fix things for was Isabel. The worst part was watching him adopt her language, her condescending tone. A few months before the wedding, they'd ambushed me at my own dinner table. "Mom," he'd said, avoiding my eyes while Isabel smirked beside him, "Izzy and I have been talking. A house this big, it's a liability at your age. We're thinking about your safety." It wasn't my safety he was thinking of. It was the prime real estate my home sat on, the clear view of the harbor, the $1 million solution to their self-inflicted financial problems. I kept telling myself it was a phase, that my real son was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of insecurity and ambition she had so expertly cultivated. I was the fixer, the one who smoothed things over, the one who would love him through this until he found his way back. But standing there in that ballroom, a spectacle of public humiliation, I realized my role had changed. I was no longer the fixer. I was the obstacle. It makes me wonder about the roles we are assigned, or the ones we take upon ourselves. Let me know in the comments. Were you the savior in your family, always fixing things for everyone else? Or were you the star, the one everyone revolved around? I'm genuinely curious to see the balance. Looking at him one last time, with his perfect hair and his empty eyes, I felt a grief so profound it almost buckled my knees. It was the grief of mourning a son who was still alive. The boy I raised was truly gone, and this stranger, this beautifully tailored puppet, was all that was left. And in that moment of absolute loss, something else was born: freedom. I was no longer bound by a mother's hope. I was free to act. I turned my back on him, on her, on all of them. I didn't run. I walked. My posture was straight, my steps measured. I could feel 200 pairs of eyes on me, a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and perhaps a sliver of respect from the few who understood what they were truly witnessing. I walked past the towering floral arrangements, past the string quartet that had fallen silent, and out into the humid Charleston night. This was not a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal to the high ground. The war had been declared, and I was on my way to get my generals. The humid low-country air felt thick and heavy as I stepped out of the air-conditioned chill of the club. The parking lot was a glittering sea of German engineering and Italian bravado. Gleaming Porsches, sleek Maseratis, and imposing Cadillac Escalades sat like polished beetles under the gas lamp-style lights. And then there was my car, parked humbly at the far end of the lot, a 10-year-old Buick LeSabre. Its paint, a quiet champagne color, was immaculate, But it was a car that screamed sensible, retired, budget-conscious. It was, in every way, the perfect chariot for the woman everyone in that ballroom believed me to be. This image, you see, was not an accident. It was a fortress. For decades, it was the carefully constructed, unassuming wall behind which my husband Robert and I built our lives and our true legacy. To the Charleston society that my son and his new wife so desperately wanted to impress, Robert Rossi had been a quiet, respected accountant who worked for a mid-sized firm downtown. He was seen as a good man who had done well for himself, but certainly not as a major player. They saw our paid-off townhouse on Trad Street as a lucky inheritance, and our simple lifestyle as the natural result of a fixed income. What they didn't see was the man who came home every night and spent 3 hours not watching television, but analyzing market trends and obscure municipal bond reports. They didn't know the Robert who, in the 1,990 seconds, took a modest inheritance, and instead of buying a bigger house, made a quiet angel investment in a fledgling software company no one had ever heard of. A company that later went public and made us a fortune we never spoke of. They didn't see the man who bought up undervalued commercial properties in the warehouse district long before it was fashionable, buildings that now generate a stream of revenue so steady it could rival a small river. Robert had a saying he repeated so often it became the foundation of our marriage. He would say, "Livia, money is a tool, not a trophy. Visible wealth attracts flies, the jealous, the greedy, the insincere. Invisible wealth grants freedom, and so we chose freedom, the freedom to live without pretense, the freedom to have friends who valued our company, not our connections, the freedom to raise a son who, we hoped, would understand that character was worth more than a brand name on a car." That was the great, tragic irony of it all. Our fortress, designed to protect our son from the corrosive influence of great wealth, had become the very thing that made me a target. Isabel and Leo didn't see my Buick as a choice. They saw it as a limitation. They saw my Talbot's cardigans not as comfortable, but as pathetic. They looked at my quiet, debt-free life and saw a resource to be plundered, a weak old woman who wouldn't even know what she was losing. They mistook my chosen simplicity for genuine poverty, my discretion for ignorance. They had no idea about the portfolio Julian Croft managed on my behalf, a portfolio so robust and diversified that it currently sits at a value of just over $12.5 million. Sitting in the familiar quiet of my Buick, the worn leather of the driver's seat a silent comfort, I finally understood the flaw in our perfect plan. We had built a fortress to protect our family from the outside world, but we never imagined the enemy would already be inside the gates. We never imagined our own son would be the one leading the siege. Robert's philosophy was that invisible wealth granted freedom. But as I sat there, the weight of Isabel's demand and Leo's betrayal pressing down on me, I realized a hard truth. Sometimes, to protect that freedom, the wealth has to be made visible. Sometimes, the tool has to be used as a weapon. And sometimes, the flies have to be swatted with the full, undeniable force of the truth. My hand, no longer trembling, reached for the old smartphone in my purse. I scrolled through my contacts, past the numbers for the garden club and my book group, until I found a name under C, a name that represented the silent, powerful engine of my life. A name no one in that ballroom would ever associate with the quiet woman in the champagne-colored Buick, Julian Croft. My finger hovered over the screen. It was time to set the engine in motion. My finger hovered over Julian's name, the screen of my phone glowing in the dark interior of my car. To understand the cold certainty in my heart at that moment, you have to understand what happened exactly 1 week before the wedding. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The sun was streaming through the tall, wavy glass windows of my living room, casting dancing patterns on the heart pine floors. The air smelled of beeswax and the salty breeze coming in from the Charleston harbor. I was arranging a bouquet of hydrangeas from my garden when the doorbell rang. It was Leo and Isabel, an unscheduled and therefore highly suspicious visit. They were a picture of feigned concern, Isabel carrying a sleek black leather portfolio that looked dangerously official. "Livia, darling," she began, kissing the air near my cheek as she swept into the room. "We didn't want to bother you, but we've just been so worried." Leo followed her like a shadow, offering me a weak, pre-rehearsed smile. They sat on my antique sofa, their modern, expensive clothes looking alien against the familiar chintz fabric. Isabel placed the portfolio on the mahogany coffee table between us with a soft thud. "With the wedding and our honeymoon, we'll be so busy," she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sweetness. "And it got us thinking about you, all alone in this big house. We want to make sure you're taken care of, that your future is secure, and that you never have to worry about a single thing again." She slid the portfolio toward me. My eyes scanned the cover page, and the genteel, peaceful afternoon came to a screeching halt. The words, printed in a severe, bold font, were, "Petition for voluntary conservatorship." My blood ran cold. A voluntary conservatorship. For those who don't know, it's a legal document where a person willingly signs over control of their life to someone else. Their finances, their property, their medical decisions, everything. By signing that paper, I would legally become a child again, and my son, guided by his viper of a wife, would become my parent. I would be a guest in my own home, living on an allowance they deemed appropriate, until they decided it was time for me to be moved into a facility of their choosing. It was a death sentence on parchment. "Mom," Leo chimed in, prompted by a sharp glance from Isabel, "it's just a formality. It makes it easier for me to help you pay bills, or to talk to your doctors if there's an emergency. It's to protect you." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it almost took my breath away. He was using the language of protection to facilitate a heist. I looked at my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and saw a stranger trying to place me in a gilded cage. They looked at me with such fake pity, as if my age alone had rendered me incapable of understanding their transparent little scheme. It was the ultimate disrespect, being treated like a problem to be managed, not a person to be honored. It's a lonely feeling, isn't it? Being the only one in the room who sees the truth. If you've ever had to smile while your gut was screaming that something was wrong, just write "I see you" in the comments. It's a quiet way of letting others know they aren't alone in their fight. I forced myself to play the part they had cast for me. I put on a look of mild confusion, my hand fluttering to my chest. "Oh my," I said, my voice a little shaky. "That sounds so official. But my bills are all on autopay, dear, and Dr. Miller and I get on so well, he tells me everything. Why would he need to speak with you?" Isabel's perfectly painted smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "It's just for emergencies, Livia, to make things simpler. There's no need to trouble your lawyer with this. It's just a family matter. We even brought a pen." She pushed a heavy gold-plated pen across the table. The finality of that gesture was chilling. They didn't want this document reviewed. They wanted it signed, sealed, and delivered before I had a moment to think. I looked from the papers, to the pen, to their expectant faces. I gave them a gentle, slightly senile smile. "You two are so thoughtful," I said softly. "But I never sign anything without letting my advisor look at it first. An old habit from your father. I'll have him review it next week." The disappointment that flashed across their faces was fleeting but undeniable. They had failed. They left soon after, cloaked in the same false affection they'd arrived in. The moment the front door clicked shut, I sank into my armchair, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was no longer just about greed. This was an attempt to erase me, to silence me, to steal my very autonomy. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I wasn't just planning to protect my assets anymore. I was planning to fight for my life. I pressed the glowing green icon on the screen. The silence in the Buick was replaced by the electronic purr of a phone ringing, a sound that seemed to echo the frantic beating of my own heart. Each ring was a countdown, a final chance to turn back, to drive away and continue my life of quiet dignity and silent suffering. But the image of Leo's back, of his definitive step away from me, was burned into my mind. The time for silence was over. On the third ring, he answered. "Livia." His voice was exactly as I remembered it, calm, deep, and carrying the weight of a professional discretion that had been passed down from father to son. Julian Croft wasn't just my financial advisor, he was a legacy. His father, Arthur Croft, had been Robert's first and only advisor, a man who had helped a young, ambitious accountant turn a small inheritance into a silent empire. When Arthur retired, Julian took over, not just as a matter of business, but as a sworn duty. He was the only other person on earth who knew the full truth of the Rossi fortune, the sole guardian of the fortress Robert and I had built. To everyone else, he was one of Charleston's most formidable legal minds. To me, he was the keeper of my secrets. He had a way of speaking that conveyed he was always 3 steps ahead of the conversation. He didn't ask if I was okay or what had happened. He simply said, "I was wondering when you might call." He already knew. He had seen the subtle signs, the unusual account inquiries from Leo, the patterns of financial desperation I had chosen to ignore. He had been waiting, patiently, for my signal. My voice, when I spoke, surprised even me. It was devoid of tears, stripped of the trembling vulnerability I had felt just minutes before. It was the voice of a CEO about to execute a hostile takeover. "Julian," I said, "it's time." A pause on the other end of the line, not of hesitation, but of confirmation. I could almost hear the click of his mind shifting from passive observation to active command. "Plan Omega?" he asked. His voice was now crisp, sharp, all business. "Execute Plan Omega," I confirmed, the words tasting like cold steel and justice. "All assets, all support, all of it. Immediately." Plan Omega was a name I had come up with years ago, a touch of melodrama that Robert would have found amusing. It was our doomsday protocol, a contingency plan Julian and I had designed shortly after Robert's death. We had imagined it would be for an external threat, a frivolous lawsuit, a sudden market collapse. We never imagined it would be deployed against our own blood. The plan was a multi-stage, systematic dismantling of the illusion they had built their lives upon. First, the immediate financial severance. A digital guillotine that would sever all the hidden threads of support I had been weaving for years. The $5,000 monthly wire transfer to a third-party account that secretly subsidized their rent would be stopped. The automatic payments covering Leo's luxury car lease and his exorbitant insurance would be canceled. The quiet bailouts of his maxed-out credit cards would cease. Second, the collation of documents. The plan dictated that Julian assemble a complete dossier. Every wire transfer, every proof of payment, every piece of evidence of their massive debt, and, most importantly, a detailed legal analysis of their attempt to have me sign away my rights via the conservatorship papers. It was our ammunition. Finally, the public leverage, the immediate cancellation of any large-scale financial guarantees made in my name, a category into which a $150,000 wedding fell quite neatly. "Are you absolutely certain, Livia?" Julian's voice was serious, a final checkpoint before the point of no return. "Once we do this, there is no reconciliation. The bridges will be turned to ash." I looked back at the warm golden glow of the Palmetto Grand Club. I saw the silhouette of my son laughing with his bride. I felt the phantom sting on my cheek. I pictured Robert's ring on Isabel's grasping hand. "Julian," I replied, my voice as cold and clear as ice. "They were the ones who set the fire. I'm just going to stop pretending it's a candle and call it the inferno at Truly Island. Burn the bridges. I'll learn to fly." A moment of respectful silence, and then, "Very well. The initial protocols are already in motion. Wires are being frozen as we speak. I'll be at your location in 30 minutes with the necessary documents for the public phase. Try not to do anything too dramatic until I arrive." A ghost of a smile touched my lips. He knew me well. I ended the call, and a profound sense of calm washed over me. The decision was made. The die was cast. I was no longer a grieving mother or a victim. I was a commander, waiting for my field marshal to arrive. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt completely and utterly in control. The 30 minutes I had to wait for Julian felt like the calm in the eye of a hurricane. The world outside my car was still and peaceful, the low hum of cicadas in the live oak trees the only sound. My gaze drifted from the parking lot back to the magnificent building that housed the wedding reception, the Palmetto Grand Club. It was the undisputed pinnacle of Charleston society, a stately monument to old money and carefully guarded prestige. With its sweeping white columns, manicured lawns that rolled down to the Ashley River, and a history stretching back to the 1920 seconds, it was more than just a venue. It was a statement. It was the ultimate symbol of arrival, the very world Isabel was clawing her way into, one financed lie at a time. I remembered the day they announced they had secured it. Isabel was practically glowing with smug triumph, waving the signed contract in the air like a trophy. Can you believe it, Livia? The Palmetto Grand. We had to pull so many strings, call in every favor we had. People wait years for a Saturday in September. This proves we're finally being taken seriously. Leo had stood beside her, beaming with a mixture of pride and sheer terror at the astronomical cost. "It's an investment, Mom," he had parroted, the words clearly fed to him by his fiancée. "An investment in our future." I had smiled, a serene, placid smile, and said how wonderful that was. But inside, the irony was so thick, so bitterly delicious, that it was almost suffocating. They had no idea. In their desperate, pathetic climb, they had chosen to stage their grandest performance on a stage that I owned. Of course, my name wasn't on the sign out front. Robert was far too clever for such vanities. Decades ago, as part of his quiet crusade to turn capital into legacy, he and 2 other discreet investors had formed a private real estate group called Palmetto Capital Ventures. Their strategy was simple: acquire iconic, undermanaged hospitality properties throughout the Carolinas. Historic inns, private coastal clubs, and one particularly prestigious golf club that was struggling financially. They had purchased the Palmetto Grand Club for a song, poured millions into restoring it to its former glory, and turned it into the cash-generating crown jewel of their portfolio. When Robert passed, his controlling stake in Palmetto Capital Ventures, and therefore in this very club, passed silently to me. The club had its own board, and a brilliant general manager who ran the day-to-day operations. I was a ghost in the machine, a name on a legal document in a vault downtown, perfectly content to receive the quarterly profit statements without ever stepping foot on the grounds in an official capacity. Isabel thought she had pulled strings. The only reason a Saturday in September magically opened up was because years ago, Julian had made a quiet call to the board, placing a permanent, unspoken hold on any date the Rossi family might ever request. They hadn't earned their spot here. They had been granted it, like a child being allowed to play with their parents' most expensive toy. The sheer, staggering arrogance of it all was breathtaking. They were planning to dispossess me of my modest townhouse while celebrating in my palace. They had slapped me, humiliated me, and plotted to steal my freedom on property that was, fundamentally, mine. The money they had borrowed at an exorbitant interest rate to pay the club's fees would have eventually cycled through the corporate structure and landed, in part, right back in my own investment accounts. They were, in the most literal sense, paying me for the privilege of their own betrayal. Robert always said true power was never having to raise your voice. It was about owning the room everyone else was shouting in. As I looked at the stately white columns, they no longer seemed like a symbol of a world I didn't belong to. They looked like the pillars of my own personal fortress. Isabel thought this club was her stage, her coronation. She was about to learn it was my courtroom. The knowledge didn't bring me joy. It brought a heavy, resolute clarity. This wasn't just about money or revenge anymore. This was about restoring order to a world they had tried so desperately to turn upside down. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the parking lot. Julian had arrived, punctual as always. The overture was over. It was time for the opera to begin. Julian's car, a dark, impossibly sleek Lincoln Continental, pulled up beside my Buick with a near-silent hum. He stepped out, a tall, imposing figure in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed to be an extension of his own formidable presence. In his hand, he carried a classic, beautiful briefcase made of dark brown leather, polished to a soft sheen. It didn't look like it held legal documents. It looked like it held the collected sins and secrets of the city. He didn't rush or show any emotion. He simply met my eyes across the expanse of the parking lot and gave a single, sharp nod. The signal was sent. The pieces were in place. I got out of my car and we met halfway, under the spectral glow of a wrought iron lamppost. "The preliminary actions are complete," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "The wire transfers have been frozen. The credit lines supporting their various vanities have been suspended. The club's management has been electronically flagged that the payment guarantee for this event is pending a final, in-person cancellation from you." He spoke not like a man discussing a family squabble, but like a general confirming that the supply lines to the enemy had been cut. He opened his briefcase and produced a slim, elegant folder, not the thick, intimidating stack of legal papers I had expected. A summary, he explained. The key figures, the timeline of your support, the estimated value of the assets they were attempting to acquire. The numbers don't lie, Livia. They will be our shield and our sword. He paused, his gaze softening for just a moment. I must ask you one last time, he said, his voice dropping slightly. This will be a public execution of their reputation and their future. It will be brutal. Once we walk through those doors, the family you knew will be a memory. Are you prepared for that? I thought of the broken glass in my palm, of the condescending pity in Isabel's eyes as she planned to strip me of my life, of my son's vacant stare. I looked at the grand ballroom, a gilded cage full of people who had watched my humiliation in silence. Julian, I said, my voice steady and clear. The family I knew died long before tonight. I am simply here to sign the death certificate. A thin, cold smile touched his lips. Very well. Our walk back to the club was the longest walk of my life. It wasn't a walk of shame or fear, it was a procession. Every step on the crushed shell pathway felt deliberate, heavy with the weight of the justice we were about to deliver. The sound of the string quartet, now playing some cheerful, forgettable tune, grew louder, a stark contrast to the grim purpose in our hearts. I could smell the night-blooming jasmine in the air, a scent I had always loved, but tonight it smelled cloying, like funeral flowers. I wasn't afraid. The fear had been burned out of me, leaving only a diamond-hard resolve. Everything in my life had taught me to be the peacemaker, to smooth over conflicts, to endure discomfort for the sake of harmony. But standing there, about to re-enter the scene of my own degradation, I understood that some forms of peace are just prisons in disguise. And to find true freedom, sometimes you have to be willing to start a war. It takes a special kind of courage to walk back into a room that has tried to break you. If you've ever had to face down your own fear just to stand up for your truth, you're part of a silent army. Let me know you're out there by simply writing, "Still standing," in the comments. We reached the grand carved oak doors. A young valet, seeing me return, moved to intercept us with a confused and slightly pitying look. "Ma'am, can I help?" he began, but Julian turned his head slightly and gave the boy a look so cold, so utterly dismissive, that the words died in his throat. He stepped back as if Julian had physically pushed him. Julian pulled open one of the heavy doors, holding it for me. A wave of noise, heat, and light washed over us. The cheerful music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. For a moment, no one noticed. Then, a few heads turned. A ripple of confusion spread from the entrance inward. Murmurs began to swell. It was her, the mother-in-law, the old woman who had been slapped. But she wasn't alone. She was with Julian Croft, and she didn't look broken anymore. She looked like the beginning of a storm. My chin was high, my back was straight, and my eyes scanned the room, ignoring the shocked faces of the guests. I was looking for only two people, the king and queen of this hollow, borrowed castle. As we stepped across the threshold, a hush fell over the room, spreading like a crack in ice. The string quartet, mid-bow, let their notes die in a discordant sigh. Laughter faltered, and conversations trailed off into confused whispers. 200 pairs of eyes, which had moments before been watching me with pity, were now wide with a delicious, morbid curiosity. In the center of the room, on the gleaming dance floor, stood the happy couple. They were caught in the middle of a pose for the photographer, Isabel's head thrown back in a practiced laugh, Leo's hand resting proprietorially on her waist. Isabel's laugh died on her lips as she saw us. Her perfectly sculpted smile dissolved, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted fury. I saw her grip tighten on Leo's arm, her knuckles white against his tuxedo sleeve. It was she who broke the silence, her voice shrill and ugly, echoing in the cavernous space. "What are you doing here? I told you you are not welcome! Security!" she shrieked, looking wildly around for someone to enforce her decree, but no one moved. All eyes were on the man standing beside me. Julian didn't so much as glance in her direction. He let her outburst hang in the air, a testament to her lack of composure, before he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it had a quality of finely honed steel that cut through the tension and commanded the attention of every person in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone calm and professional, "please accept my sincere apologies for this interruption to your evening." He then directed his gaze to a distinguished, silver-haired man in a tuxedo, standing near the main bar, Mr. Martinez, the club's general manager. "Mr. Martinez," Julian called out, his voice projecting effortlessly. "My name is Julian Croft. I am the legal and financial counsel for Mrs. Livia Rossi. I am here to formally and officially rescind the financial guarantee she personally provided for this event, effective immediately." If the silence before had been heavy, the silence now was a physical weight, pressing down on all of us. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones, which had been discreetly lowered, were now raised high, their small red recording lights blinking like malevolent eyes in the dim, romantic lighting. Isabel's face went from furious to utterly bewildered. "Financial guarantee? What is he talking about, Leo?" she hissed. But Leo could only stare, his face the color of ash. Mr. Martinez, ever the professional, made his way towards us, his expression a perfect mask of polite concern. "Mr. Croft, Mrs. Rossi," he said with a slight bow of his head, "this is a highly irregular course of action. The event contract, as you know, holds the guarantor responsible for the full final cost." He didn't need to say the number. We all knew it. $150,000. "Indeed it does," Julian replied smoothly, opening his briefcase with a soft click. He produced the slim folder. "And my client, the guarantor, is now exercising her legal right to withdraw that guarantee due to extraordinary circumstances involving material breach of faith." He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod in Isabel's direction. "As of this precise moment, 9:36 p.m., Wednesday, September 17th, the full and immediate financial responsibility for this event reverts to the contract's primary signatories, Mr. Leo Rossi and his bride, Miss Isabel Croft." Isabel finally understood. That's insane. You can't do that," she sputtered, her voice cracking with the first notes of genuine panic. Mr. Martinez turned his impassive gaze from us to the newlyweds. The mask of politeness was still there, but his eyes were like chips of granite. "My apologies, Mr. and Mrs. Rossi," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "But in light of this development, and without a valid financial guarantee on file, I must request an alternative form of payment for the outstanding balance. Immediately. A certified check or a completed wire transfer would be acceptable. Otherwise," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "I will have no choice but to suspend all services, catering, bar, and music, and regretfully ask all of your guests to depart the premises." The first lifeline was cut. The beautiful, opulent wedding, the grand symbol of their arrival into Charleston society, had just been publicly reduced to what it truly was, a massive, unpaid bill. They stood there, frozen, in the center of their collapsing world, with 200 people watching them wait for a financial execution. And I simply stood and watched, a silent queen observing the first crumble of a false empire. The manager's ultimatum hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Leo, for the first time since I had re-entered the room, looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with a desperate, childish plea. It was the same look he'd given me when he was 10 and had accidentally broken a neighbor's window. "Fix this, Mom." But I was no longer the fixer. Isabel, however, was not one to be silenced by mere reality. "This is a private matter," she snapped at Mr. Martinez, her voice a desperate squeak. "A misunderstanding. My father will have this sorted out by morning." She was bluffing, and everyone in the room knew it. Her father, a man who sold mid-range insurance in North Carolina, couldn't have produced that kind of money if he'd mortgaged his entire life. Before her bluff could gain any traction, Julian took a deliberate step forward, his polished shoes making a soft, authoritative sound on the marble floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply shifted his focus to my son. "Mr. Rossi," he began, his tone now laced with a cold, almost academic disappointment. "Perhaps we should address the source of this misunderstanding. It seems to be rooted in a fundamental disconnect between your perceived lifestyle and your actual financial reality. Julian opened the slim folder. He didn't read from it. He merely glanced at it, as if to confirm a minor detail. His memory was flawless, his execution surgical. "Let's begin with your residence," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. The two-bedroom apartment at the Jasper, a beautiful property, with a magnificent view of the harbor. The monthly rent, as you know, is $5,000, a significant sum for a man on your reported salary. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Which is likely why, for the past 24 months, an anonymous wire transfer for that exact amount has been deposited into your landlord's holding account on the first of every month. You told friends it was a corporate discount you had cleverly negotiated. The truth, Mr. Rossi, is that your mother was paying your rent. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. I saw Isabel's mother clutch her husband's arm, her face a mask of horror. Julian continued, relentless. Then, there is the matter of your vehicle. The new BMW 5 Series parked outside. A fine automobile. The lease payment of $950 a month, plus the rather steep insurance for a driver with your record, has also been subsidized through a similar, discreet arrangement. Leo flinched as if he'd been struck. Julian wasn't finished. And of course the credit cards. The American Express Platinum card you use for your frequent dinners at Hall's Chop House and your weekend trips. I have here a record of 7 instances in the past 12 months where a maxed-out balance ranging from $5,000 to $10,000 was paid off in full by a third-party transfer. Those transfers, totaling over $44,000, originated from a trust account managed by my firm, an account belonging to Mrs. Livia Rossi. Watching their perfect, curated world crumble under the weight of simple, verifiable facts was a strange experience. It wasn't triumphant, it was just sad. It was the exposure of a deep sickness, the kind that festers when people value the appearance of success more than the reality of their own character. We all know people like that, don't we? The ones who live a life for the camera, for the applause, but are hollow inside when no one is watching. If this story is making you think of a situation where things just didn't add up, you're not alone. Don't name names, but if you understand what I mean, just type the word facade in the comments below. Let's see how many of us have seen the mask slip. The final blow came when Julian closed the folder with a soft final snap. He looked directly at Leo and Isabel, his expression unreadable. In total, over the last 2 years, my client has secretly subsidized your lifestyle to the tune of over $220,000. He let the number hang in the air, a devastating price tag on their deception, a lifestyle you use to project an image of wealth and success, a lifestyle you use to justify your condescension and contempt for the very woman who was quietly and lovingly funding your entire existence. The room was utterly still. The truth was out, raw and undeniable. They weren't a power couple on the rise. They were children, living on a secret allowance from a mother they had tried to discard like a piece of old furniture. There was nowhere left for them to hide. The air in the ballroom was thick with the fallout of Julian's revelations. It was so quiet I could hear the fizzing of champagne bubbles in a glass someone had abandoned on a nearby table. Leo stood catatonic, a statue of a man chiseled from regret. But Isabel was a cornered animal. Defeat was not a language she spoke. Her shock curdled into a venomous, desperate rage. "You're lying!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Julian. "All of it! It's a trick! This is what you do, isn't it?" She then turned her venom on me. A pathetic fantasy spun by a lonely, jealous old woman who can't bear to see her son happy and successful without her. You want him to need you, to be your little boy forever. Her voice climbed to a hysterical pitch. She whirled back to my son, her eyes blazing. "Leo, don't just stand there. Tell them. Tell these people the truth. Tell them how we built our life together." It was her final, desperate gamble, to force Leo to choose, to lie for her, to uphold the facade they had so carefully constructed. All he had to do was say something, anything, to cast a shadow of doubt. But he couldn't. He just looked at her, then at me, and a single silent tear traced a path down his ashen cheek. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was his confession. And in his silent admission of guilt, Isabel finally understood that she was utterly and completely alone. Julian waited patiently for her tirade to extinguish itself. His unflappable calm served only to magnify her unhinged hysteria. When she was finally silent, her chest heaving with ragged breaths, he spoke. "Miss Croft, as I stated, my firm does not deal in fantasies. We deal in legally binding realities." He reached into his briefcase one last time. "Which brings me to my final point this evening." He withdrew a single, folded document. It was different from the papers in the folder. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored legal bond, bound with a dark blue ribbon. It radiated a solemn, irrefutable authority. "This," Julian announced, his voice resonating with a new gravity, "is a legal addendum, a codicil, to the last will and testament of Mrs. Livia Rossi. It was drafted 1 week ago following a rather illuminating conversation about the nature of voluntary conservatorships." He let that phrase hang in the air for a moment. "It was signed, witnessed, and notarized at my office this afternoon at precisely 5:17 p.m. He carefully untied the ribbon. "I will not bore you with the legal jargon," he said, his eyes finding Leo in the crowd. "I will simply summarize the key revisions. First, the property at 57 Trad Street, Charleston, the historical Rossi family home with a current market appraisal of $1.8 million. This property was to be bequeathed in its entirety to Mr. Leo Rossi. As of today's date, that clause has been struck. The property is to be placed in a charitable trust upon my client's passing." Isabel let out a small, strangled gasp. Julian continued, his gaze shifting to her. "Second, all personal effects therein, including art, antiques, and family heirlooms." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Most notably, the gold signet ring of the late Robert Rossi, are to be preserved within the same trust, never to be sold or gifted outside the Foundation's charter." It was a direct, surgical strike aimed at the very thing that had started the night's hostilities. "And finally," Julian said, his voice dropping to an almost funereal tone, "the principal asset, the Rossi Family Trust, with a current valuation of $12.5 million. Mr. Leo Rossi was, until this afternoon, the sole named beneficiary." He refolded the document with slow, deliberate precision. "As of 5:17 p.m. today, his name, and the names of any of his potential heirs or spouses, have been permanently and irrevocably removed." The death blow. It wasn't just about losing an allowance or a wedding. This was the sound of a future being annihilated. Leo made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp, and physically stumbled back. His hand went to his chest, as if he couldn't breathe. He had just watched his entire life, the life he felt he was owed, evaporate into thin air. Isabel's face, which had been a storm of rage, was now a horrifying blank canvas. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a waxy, doll-like pallor. The long game, the years of manipulation, the strategic marriage, all of it had been for nothing. She had gambled everything on an inheritance that no longer existed. In that moment, watching the ruin I had wrought, I felt no victory, only a vast, cavernous sadness. This wasn't a celebration. It was a funeral for the son I had lost, and for the future he had so carelessly thrown away. A strangled, guttural sound came from Isabel's throat. Her mind, so quick and calculating when it came to acquisitions, was now scrambling to process a total, irreversible loss. The blank shock on her face was slowly being replaced by a frantic, disbelieving rage. "Where?" she whispered, the word ragged and raw. She took a stumbling step forward, her eyes wild, fixed on Julian. "Where does it go? The money, the house. If not to Leo, then where?" It was the last gasp of a dying predator, no longer concerned with appearances, only with the kill that had escaped her grasp. She didn't care about the why, she only cared about the what. Julian regarded her for a moment, not with pity or contempt, but with the detached air of a historian observing a predictable, if tragic, human folly. He then turned his attention from her and addressed the room at large, his voice resonating with the clarity of a formal pronouncement. "To answer your question, Miss Croft, and for the public record," he began, "all assets, properties, and liquid funds previously designated for Mr. Prives." Rossi will now serve as the founding endowment for a new, legally chartered, non-profit charitable organization. He paused, letting the weight of the announcement settle into the silent room before delivering the final, poetic stroke of justice. The organization will be named the Rossi Foundation for Elder Justice. The name itself was a judgment. It was a mission statement born from the ashes of their betrayal. Julian continued, outlining the foundation's purpose with cold, irrefutable precision. The Rossi Foundation will be dedicated to providing pro bono legal and financial advocacy for senior citizens who are the victims of financial abuse and exploitation, particularly from within their own families. It will fund legal battles against fraudulent conservatorships, help recover stolen assets, and provide counsel to ensure that the elderly can manage their affairs with the dignity and autonomy they deserve. He wasn't finished. Furthermore, the foundation will establish a public education initiative to raise awareness about the subtle tactics of familial coercion and manipulation. A significant portion of the endowment will also be used to create and fund temporary safe housing for elderly individuals who need to escape abusive domestic situations. As Julian spoke, I saw the looks on the faces of the guests change. The morbid curiosity was being replaced by something else, something akin to awe. They were no longer watching a family drama. They were witnessing the birth of a legacy. To that end, Julian concluded, his gaze finally resting on me, Mrs. Livia Rossi will preside as the foundation's director. Her home on Trad Street, upon her passing, will be deeded to the foundation in perpetuity, serving as its official headquarters. It will stand as a symbol of the foundation's core mission, to be a sanctuary of dignity, not a target for greed. As Julian laid out the architecture of my new life, I felt the last of the icy grief in my chest begin to thaw, replaced by something I hadn't felt in years, a white-hot purpose. This wasn't a decision made in the heat of vengeful anger in the parking lot. The seed of this idea had been planted a week ago, in the quiet of my living room, when they slid those conservatorship papers across my coffee table. In their attempt to declare me incompetent, they had shown me my true calling. I realized then that my story, in all its painful detail, was not unique. It was a privileged version of a silent tragedy playing out in countless homes. My pain didn't have to be an ending. It could be a beginning. It could be forged into a shield for others. I believe that's one of the most incredible things about the human spirit, our ability to build something beautiful from the absolute wreckage of our lives. If you have ever taken a painful experience from your past and used it to become a stronger, kinder, or wiser person, I want to honor that. You don't need to share the story, but just type "I grew" in the comments. It's a powerful testament to the resilience we all share. The beauty of the foundation was its finality. The money was no longer mine to control, or, in a moment of weakness, to give back. It belonged to a cause. It was protected, shielded, and aimed like a weapon in the service of good. There was nothing left for them to bargain for, to manipulate, to hope for. I hadn't just disinherited my son. I had repurposed his inheritance into a monument to his own failure of character. They stood there, Isabel and Leo, not just facing a future of poverty, but a future haunted by the legacy of the good they could have done, the lives they could have changed, had they simply chosen love over greed. The creation of the Rossi Foundation was the final, devastating sentence in a verdict that had already been delivered. It transformed my act of self-preservation from a family matter into a public spectacle of philanthropy. It was, as Julian later called it, a checkmate of staggering elegance. For Isabel, it was the final unbearable turn of the screw. The rage that had been building inside her finally exploded, and the beautiful, composed mask she wore for the world shattered into a million pieces. She emitted a sound that was not quite human, a raw, guttural scream of pure, thwarted ambition. Then, she whirled on my son. All the cloying sweetness, the performative love, the saccharine terms of endearment, all of it vanished, burned away by the acid of her fury. "You!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she lunged at him, shoving him hard in the chest. "This is your fault. You were supposed to handle her. You were supposed to have a backbone. You promised me. You weak, useless mama's boy. You promised me everything." Leo, lost in his own catatonic state of shock, stumbled back from the force of her push. He didn't defend himself. He didn't even seem to register the attack. He was a hollow man, a ghost at his own wedding, his eyes still locked on me, haunted by the magnitude of what he had lost. Isabel's parents, their faces pale with humiliation, rushed forward to grab their hysterical daughter, who was now sobbing and screaming incoherently about contracts and promises and the injustice of it all. The perfect bride had devolved into a public spectacle of greed and despair. The spell that had held the guests captive was broken. The room erupted into a cacophony of hushed, urgent whispers. I saw Isabel's bridesmaids, who had been preening for photos just an hour before, now huddled together, their eyes wide with a delicious horror. They were backing away slowly, distancing themselves from the social contagion of failure. The older guests, the ones who had known my husband and me for decades, looked at me with a new, profound understanding. I received several slow, deliberate nods of respect from across the room. They understood the language of legacy, and they had just witnessed a brutal, but necessary defense of it. The younger crowd, meanwhile, was experiencing the event not as a social gathering, but as content. Their phones were up, recording the meltdown, their thumbs flying across screens as they texted the salacious details to everyone they knew. Before we had even left the room, the story of the Rossi wedding implosion was already becoming a legend in the digital circles of Charleston society. Mr. Martinez, seeing that his event had devolved from a wedding into a potential liability, acted with swift, merciless efficiency. He gave a subtle signal to his staff. The romantic, dim lighting was abruptly replaced by the harsh, flat glare of the ballroom's full overheads. The unflattering light exposed everything: Isabel's tear-streaked makeup, Leo's ashen face, the pity and contempt on the faces of the guests. The bar staff began quietly covering the liquor bottles. The catering staff started clearing away plates of half-eaten filet mignon. The string quartet was already packing their cellos into their cases. The party was over. The final indignity came in the form of a junior staff member approaching Leo and Isabel with a portable credit card terminal and a long, itemized bill. The glowing screen displayed the horrifying number, $150,000. They were being presented with the check for a life they could not afford, in a room full of people they could no longer impress. I watched it all with a strange, clinical detachment. It was like watching a controlled demolition. You know it's necessary. You know what the outcome will be. But it's still a violent, heartbreaking thing to witness the destruction of something you once helped to build. There was no joy, no triumph. Just a vast, weary emptiness. Julian touched my elbow, his touch, a gentle anchor in the swirling chaos. "Livia," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise. "It's done. We can go home now." I nodded, feeling the immense weight of the last 2 years finally begin to lift from my shoulders. I did not look at my son or his hysterical bride again. As Julian and I walked towards the exit, the path cleared before us. We were no longer the center of the drama. All eyes were fixed on the train wreck at the center of the room. The sounds of Isabel's weeping and the awkward, shuffling silence of departing guests faded behind me as we stepped back out into the calm, quiet Charleston night. The storm had passed. We were almost at the doors, almost free. The chaos of the ballroom, the sounds of Isabel's weeping and the frantic murmurs of the guests was a storm at our backs. I could feel the cool night air on my face, a promise of peace. I had done what I came to do. My war was over. I had leveled the battlefield, salted the earth, and I was ready to go home. But a final, desperate cry cut through the noise. "Wait!" It was Isabel. She had broken away from her parents' grasp and was stumbling towards us, her magnificent $1,000 wedding gown dragging on the floor, collecting dust and debris. Her face was a ruin of smeared mascara and tear-streaked foundation, but her eyes burned with the last, desperate embers of a fire that refused to die. She stopped a few feet from me, her chest heaving, a cornered animal making its last stand. Leo trailed a few paces behind her, a broken, silent shadow. "You can't do this," she panted, her voice ragged. "You can't just walk away after destroying everything. This is your family. Leo is your only son. What will people say? You're destroying the Rossi name, your own legacy. For what?" She gestured wildly. "For a stupid ring? For a little bit of pride?" She was trying to reframe the narrative one last time, to cast me as the vengeful matriarch, the destroyer of families, and herself as the innocent victim of an old woman's spite. It was a pathetic, transparent ploy, but it was all she had left. I stopped and turned, slowly. Julian subtly moved to my side, a silent, protective presence, but I held up a hand. This was mine to finish. I looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time without a filter of maternal hope for my son's happiness. I saw her not as a daughter-in-law, but as a hostile corporate raider who had attempted a clumsy, brutal takeover of my life's work. The fear was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a profound, unshakable calm. "Family?" I asked, my voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced her. "You dare to speak to me of family? Let me tell you what family is, Isabel. Family is loyalty. It is respect, earned and given. It is a sacred trust. It is not a business transaction. It is not a conspiracy whispered over brunch. You tried to liquidate my son's soul for a down payment on a life you didn't earn, and you were arrogant enough to think I wouldn't read the fine print. I took a step closer. The family you speak of was a hollow corporation built on my money and your ambition, and tonight I simply initiated a leveraged buyout." Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I wasn't finished. "And the ring," I continued, my voice dropping lower. "You still don't understand, do you? After all this, you still see it as a stupid ring. You thought you were fighting me for an object, for a piece of gold. I was fighting to protect a legacy. You are not worthy to speak my husband's name, let alone wear a symbol of his honor." I looked her dead in the eye. "You see things, Isabel. I see value. And you, my dear, have none." In that moment, looking at her empty, grasping desperation, I finally understood the fundamental chasm between us. She knew the price of everything, the car, the apartment, the wedding, but she didn't understand the value of a single thing. My husband's ring had a price, my house had a price. But my dignity, my history, the legacy of a 40-year love story, those things are priceless. It's a lesson that takes some of us a lifetime to learn, isn't it? What is the one thing in your life that is absolutely priceless? It could be a memory, a principle, a person you love. You don't have to explain it. Just type that one word in the comments. Let's fill this space with things that money can't buy. My gaze drifted past her to my son. He stood there, finally looking at me, his face a canvas of utter devastation. He had heard every word. For the briefest of moments, I saw the 10-year-old boy in his eyes, the one who knew right from wrong, but it was too late. I held his gaze for a long second, and in that silence, I said everything that was left to say. "Goodbye. You chose this. This is the consequence." Then, without another word, I turned my back on both of them for the final time. I let Julian guide me out of the heavy oak doors and into the quiet of the night. There would be no more confrontations. The final word had been spoken. 6 months. Half a year has passed since that night at the Palmetto Grand Club, a night that now feels like it happened in another lifetime, to another woman. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been my companion for 2 years is gone, replaced by a quiet that fills my old townhouse. It's a peaceful, liberating silence, the kind that only comes after a long and necessary storm. For the first time in a long time, my home feels like a sanctuary again, not a fortress under siege. In the weeks that followed the wedding, the fallout for Leo and Isabel was as swift as it was brutal. The story, fueled by 200 well-connected witnesses, ripped through Charleston society like a wildfire. They became social pariahs overnight. The eviction notice for their apartment arrived within the month. Without my secret support, their mountain of debt, the $220,000 they had amassed to build their house of cards, came crashing down. Bankruptcy was inevitable. Leo's employer, a conservative firm that valued its reputation above all else, quietly let him go. Isabel's dream of being a high society consultant and influencer became a local joke. The last I heard, they had retreated, defeated, to live in a spare bedroom in her parents' modest suburban home in North Carolina, a far cry from a townhouse overlooking the Charleston harbor. But the story didn't stay in Charleston. In the age of the internet, no story ever does. The dozens of cell phone videos from the wedding guests inevitably found their way online. At first, They were sensationalized snippets on local gossip sites and Reddit threads, with headlines like, "Crazy Motherinlaw destroys son's wedding." I was painted as the villain, the unhinged, vengeful matriarch. For a few days, I was inundated with a level of anonymous digital hatred that I couldn't have imagined. Then, something shifted. Longer, more complete videos began to surface. A clearer clip of the initial confrontation went viral: the slap, Isabel's cruel words about a lonely old woman, and a dead man's ring. Then came the videos of the second act, Julian's calm, methodical dissection of their finances, his clear, unimpeachable delivery of the facts. The public narrative began to pivot, slowly at first, and then with overwhelming force. People in the comments sections started to look past the sensationalism. They saw a daughter-in-law whose entitlement was breathtaking. They saw a son whose weakness was a betrayal in itself. And they saw a 68-year-old woman who had endured a public, physical assault and responded not with hysterics, but with a calculated, strategic, and frankly, brilliant defense. My story stopped being my story. It became a vessel for the pain and frustration of thousands of people. The emails and letters began as a trickle, forwarded to me through Julian's office, and then became a flood. A retired teacher from Ohio wrote about her son, who had convinced her to sign over the deed to her house. A man from California shared the story of his siblings trying to have their father declared incompetent to get their hands on his retirement fund. A woman from Texas confessed she had been secretly paying her adult daughter's credit card bills for years, enduring constant disrespect and emotional blackmail. I was no longer just Livia Rossi. Online, I was given names: the Velvet Hammer, the Charleston Queen. I had become an unwilling, anonymous folk hero for a silent generation of parents who had given everything, only to be seen as an obstacle or an ATM. Their last, desperate legal challenge was the final nail in their coffin. They petitioned the court to contest the codicil to my will, using my erratic and emotional outburst at the wedding as proof of my mental instability. Julian dismantled their case in a single hearing. He presented the judge with the premeditated conservatorship papers, the complete financial dossier of their deception, and, as a final flourish, a data report on the overwhelmingly supportive public sentiment from the viral videos. The judge threw the case out, citing it as a frivolous and predatory lawsuit, and ordered them to pay my legal fees. I sat in my quiet living room, the afternoon sun warming the floorboards, with a stack of letters from strangers beside me. The public humiliation I had so dreaded had transformed into a wave of public validation. The world, it turned out, hadn't seen a villain. It had seen a woman who had finally decided to fight back. And in their stories, in their words of encouragement, I realized the Rossi Foundation for Elder Justice wasn't just a good idea, it was a necessary one. My private war was over, but a much larger battle was just beginning. 2 years. It feels both like an eternity and the blink of an eye since I walked out of that ballroom and into a new life. The woman who re-entered her quiet townhouse that night is not the same woman who sits here today, writing this. The pain, once a raw, gaping wound, has healed into a scar, a reminder not of the injury, but of the fact that I survived it and became stronger in the broken places. My home on Trad Street is different now, too. The formal living room, where Leo and Isabel once tried to trap me with their conservatorship papers, is now the main meeting space for the Rossi Foundation for Elder Justice. The heavy mahogany table is where our clients' frightened, confused, and betrayed seniors sit across from our lawyers and find for the first time a powerful ally in their corner. My son's old bedroom, a space I once kept as a shrine to a boy who no longer existed, is now my office. The walls are not filled with his childhood photos, but with letters of gratitude, newspaper clippings about laws we've helped change, and photos of the families we've helped put back together the right way, with boundaries and respect. The foundation is no longer just an idea, it is a force. In these 2 years, we have taken on over 80 cases across the Carolinas. We have successfully overturned 17 fraudulent conservatorships. We have recovered nearly $3 million in assets that had been stolen, coerced, or swindled from the elderly by their own flesh and blood. Every case is a variation on my own story. Every victory is a reclamation of the dignity they tried to strip from me. Julian serves as the chairman of our board, his formidable legal mind now a shield for the vulnerable. We hired a brilliant firebrand young attorney named Anya Sharma to run the day-to-day operations, a woman who left a lucrative corporate job because she said my story reminded her of what happened to her own grandmother. This is my family now, a small, fierce army of advocates, bound not by blood but by a shared purpose. As for the family I lost, their story unraveled as quickly as it had been woven together with lies. Without my financial support to insulate them from reality, the flimsy foundation of their marriage crumbled. They declared bankruptcy 6 months after the wedding. 8 months after that, they divorced. Their union, it turned out, was a business partnership that had gone spectacularly bust. Isabel, I'm told, has moved somewhere out west, a new city, a new name, likely searching for a new investor. Leo has tried to contact me 3 times. Each call was a clumsy, painful dance of self-pity and blame, always circling back to his financial desperation. There was never a true apology, never a full accounting for the choices he made. The last time he called, 6 months ago, his voice was thin and reedy. "Don't you see what you've done?" he'd asked. "You've ruined my life. All because your pride was more important than your son." The old Livia would have absorbed that blame, would have felt that familiar pang of maternal guilt. But she was gone. I answered him with a calm clarity that was as foreign to him as it was liberating for me. "Leo," I said, "your pride was more important than your mother's dignity. Your ambition was more important than your character. Your life is the sum of your own choices. I am no longer one of them." I wished him peace, and then I hung up. We have not spoken since. He needs to find his own salvation. I can no longer be it. I am not the lonely old woman Isabel tried to name me. I am the founder and director of a respected foundation. I give lectures at law schools. I consult with state senators on elder protection legislation. My quiet life has become a very loud, very busy one, and I have never felt more at peace. I've learned that the most profound revenge is not the destruction you cause, but the magnificent, meaningful life you build from the ashes. My story of betrayal is over. But my story of purpose? That is just beginning. Tonight, as I finish telling you this story, a soft rain is falling over Charleston. I'm sitting in my office, looking out at the lights twinkling across the harbor. This is the same view that Isabel once saw as a prize to be won, a piece of real estate. But to me, it has always been a reminder that the world is vast, and that even after the most violent storm, the water eventually becomes calm again. The peace I feel now is not the quiet of loneliness, but the profound tranquility of a life lived with purpose and without apology. The greatest lesson from all this pain is that true strength is not found in how much you can endure, but in what you refuse to tolerate. For years, I believed that a mother's love had to be unconditional, even if it meant sacrificing my own dignity. I was wrong. The most loving thing I could have ever done for my son was not to shield him from the consequences of his choices, but to let him face them, and the most loving thing I could do for myself was to finally say, "No more." My story began with a slap that was meant to silence me, but it ends with my voice being stronger than ever, a voice I now use to protect others. It's a quiet ending, but it's a powerful one. It's the kind of peace that comes from knowing you have honored yourself and the life you were given. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to a difficult but necessary chapter of my life. The world may never fully know what you've been through, but we, in this community, we understand. If this story, or any part of it, spoke a truth you carry in your heart, please subscribe. Join us. Let's continue to build this space where our stories are not just told, but honored. Until next time, be kind to yourselves and never, ever forget the value of your own story.